Hello and welcome to another video from the AHF. We're looking at another article on self-defense with the sword, and that is the drawing of the sword against a determined attacker. Now why we want to study this is largely because we're looking at the use of swords for more than just their sportive purposes and modern martial arts, but actually the historical martial arts and the context of how they were used as well. We cover this a bit more, this sort of subject, in the saber video on the similar 21-foot rule, so if you want to go back and look at that, it's quite a long video, has a lot more information in it. So I'm just going to go on to very quickly what the 21-foot rule is if you haven't seen the saber video. It's a modern rule for law enforcement where you're carrying a gun as a sidearm pistol, and it's considered to be the minimum safe distance that you can perceive a threat against a knife attacker, draw your gun and fire 2 shots at the centre body mass. And it's a little bit controversial in some parts as well, but it's nonetheless a rule which is still used today and sort of modified versions of it. And we're looking now at a similar kind of principle. So we covered the sabre in the last video. Now looking at the rapier, which is quite a different weapon, mainly that it just is so much larger and quite point orientated as opposed to a cut orientated sabre. First thing you need to know about a rapier is it's not all about the point. It's point orientated, but it can still cut. It has reduced cutting power compared to a lot of other traditional one-handed swords, but it can still cut. You just have to build up a good amount of power and strike to more vulnerable target zones than maybe you had to with a sabre. So it can cut. This particular example is the Denelli Basic Rapier, which has become one of the most common training swords for rapier in the world, I would say, the last sort of year or two. It has a 42-inch blade, which is approximately 107 centimeters. That's sort of a quite common length historically, and probably the most common length that people use today. You'll often see me in videos use actually a 45 and occasionally even a 46.5 inch. And I'm going to go a bit more into why they will be an absolute swine to have to draw, and I will at some stage use those on drawing videos, but I currently haven't got a scabbard that's long enough to fit them in because they are absolutely massive. So this is a 42-inch, it's a nice average common size and quite useful for what we want to do, and the sword weighs 1 kilo. This is a typical rapier. This is a Spanish cup hilt, but as I teach Italian rapier, for this drill we're doing, there's not really much difference. So there's the weapon. The belt choice is a very classic rapier belt which has 2 suspension points and fits onto the side of our body at quite a horizontal angle compared to what we're used to seeing with things like a sabre or any kind of other shorter one-handed sword. The simple reason for that is because it's very, very long, and the long swords are very commonly worn in that way as well. So yeah, quite sort of flat horizontal as opposed to the vertical or almost vertical you'll see with a lot of other shorter sword designs. Now always remember on the 21-foot rule that there are lots of variables that can affect the rule, and that can be what kind of attacker you have, what kind of defender you are, your size, your height, your speed, your training, the ground surface sort of area. There are a lot of factors that can affect it, but we're going to look at this particular scenario that's a flat sort of terrain, roughly equivalent height opponents, and this is, I suppose, the ideal scenario where you are actually facing your attacker and you perceive the threat, have the time to draw in a set distance. And the way the drill is going to work is the knife fighter starts with a knife behind their back. As soon as they withdraw it from behind their back, they can rush, and the rapier user can draw his sword and defend. In terms of what we want to achieve with the rapier for self-defense, well, with the 21-foot rule for pistol, it is 2 shots into centre body mass. Now, the key to this is survival. We don't have to kill our opponent, but we want to be unhurt ourselves, whether we do hit them or not. So if you can, for example, make your opponent stop in their tracks and just realise that they've made a mistake, they're coming at you with a knife, you've got a good length sword ready to use it, that's great, because they hopefully will just back off, or you're then fighting a normal fight, but you have a massive advantage. So you don't have to deal the strike within what we're doing, but you have to get to the sort of position where you are safe and able to respond afterwards. So you might hit them, you might not, but the key to it is not being hit yourself by that knife fighter. As for striking with the rapier is thrust orientated, as I've already said, We are going to do a mix of thrust and cut work. The thing you have to appreciate with using the thrust for this kind of self-defense scenario where somebody's rushing at you is, can you be essentially guaranteed of stopping them with the thrust? And I would say often no. There's a good chance you're going to run them through and they're still going to get to you and they're still going to stab you. They might die later, but if they manage to stab you with a knife, they might even stab you multiple times, then you've already failed. And you're not interested in what happens to them, you're interested in your own survival. So you have to bear that in mind. And we're going to see a range of scenarios. Of course, it's difficult for us to simulate sometimes how it would actually be with the thrust going into somebody and then carry on going on top of it. But always just bear in mind, there is a sizable chance that you land that thrust, they're going to keep coming at you. If, however, you can actually slow them down and then strike them once they've already slowed down or come to a stop, that is a much safer scenario where the thrust becomes really, really useful. Okay, so when we started this drill, we started with Artur as the attacker, and Artur is one of the fittest and fastest members in the club, and I had only just started doing the draw stuff with the Rapier. So initially we started a few 21-foot sort of practice drills, and he was getting on top of me because he was very fast with it. Now again, historical footwear and historical surfaces and things like that, maybe it'd be a bit slower, but even so you have to consider that there would have been people as fast as Artur, and I'm sure they would have managed to do it on surfaces and in good enough shoes to cover that distance. However, as I practiced more and more and more, my distances were getting shorter and shorter and shorter. However, historically, people wouldn't, or many people would not have been practicing fast draws all the time. It wouldn't have been practiced like, say, the police do today with their handguns. Some would, but a lot wouldn't. So we increased the distance. We increased it to 24 feet. And when we moved to 24 feet, we instantly found that even though I hadn't done a lot of draws with the sword at that time, and also was very, very fast, I was able to every single time safely draw and stop him in his tracks. So that was the initial point of, if the person doing the draw isn't particularly confident or hasn't done a lot of drawing recently and regular practice with it, and your opponent is very, very fast, then 24 feet we found was the actual distance that you needed to make it work. However, as time went on and I actually did more practice with the Rapier, then I was able to get the distances down, and you can see now a range of different distances. And we found that 21 feet was easily doable once you'd actually got a bit of practice in. However, that assumes that you perceive the threat quickly and you don't hesitate. In terms of distances under 21 feet, we found that, as you might expect, it would really come down to your confidence and your training, how many times you've drawn and how familiar you are with it. And we found that if you were confident and skilled enough with it, you could actually get the distances down to maybe even 12 feet. But at 12 feet, you see, it does become quite risky. It depends, do you hesitate? Do you get the draw out cleanly? How fast is your opponent? I would say at 12 to 15, that's a very, very risky distance in that I'm often able to defend against it, but not with all the power I would like. So I would say the 12 to 15 distance, which is kind of what we found with the saber as well. 12 to 15 distance is that which you couldn't confidently say you could defend yourself every single time. So I would say with the Rapier, we found with the saber it was sort of an 18 to 21 foot was the safe range distance. I thought the Rapier would have been a lot slower than the saber. But actually we found that with a bit of practice, not much, but a bit of practice, we were able to get the distances in to be about the same, with that 18 to 21 feet being a confident distance that you could draw with. How the length actually affected this compared to when we were using the saber, bearing in mind that the saber was a 32.5 inch blade, this is a 42-inch blade, so the difference is absolutely massive. I thought it was going to really slow things down, but actually with a bit of practice we were able to get the distances and the timings to very much be in line with the saber. The one huge difference is that the sheer length of this weapon, drawing it out, and you look at your arm span, I mean some people have longer arms than me, fair enough, but certainly for the time period of these people carrying these weapons, my height was kind of average anyway. I found that if I got my grip slightly wrong, if I tried to draw a little bit too fast on the angles, or if in any way I just made a slight mistake, then the tip of the rapier will get snagged in the scabbard and I'd be stuck. And that kind of thing just did not happen with the sabre because it was short enough that there was no real risk of that happening. Whereas with the rapier, there's a real risk just because it's so long that you get stuck towards the end. So it's not so much that we found that using, say, a rapier over a sabre made our draw time sort of longer or needed more distance to actually draw the sword, just that there was an increased risk of getting stuck on the way out if you were really in a rush and you didn't quite get the angles right. So to be as good with the draw with the rapier as with the sabre, you just needed to be cooler headed, you needed a little bit more experience, and there was less margin of error, if you like. The sabre was a quick and easy draw, the rapier a little bit more complex. Now in the sabre video we did a lot of cutting from the draw. You actually cut and actually strike your opponent with a cut from the draw action, draw up to hanging guard. Now, could you do that with a rapier? I'm inclined to say no. I've done a lot of cutting practice with the rapier, and there is no doubt that the rapier can cut, but it needs a good arc of motion and it needs to hit vulnerable target zones. If you draw the rapier, again, the length does interfere. You can't get a clean cut from the draw like you can with a sabre, and the angle that it's coming at, it's quite a low cut. You're going to be hitting not particularly great target zones with not particularly great bit of power. I would say the chances of you actually stopping a determined attacker with a draw cut from the scabbard with a rapier is almost zero. However, you can use that draw cut into some kind of parry position. And you'll see this in a range of different scenarios where I draw later on against a sword and do a parry, or draw into a position where you've engaged the weapon or something like that. So you can draw in an action, draw and cut, and do something useful with it, but it's not a cut that's going to stop the opponents at all. It's a cut into their blade or a cut to do something else afterwards. How you then responded, again with the sabre we found that going backwards gained you a little bit of extra time to actually do the draw, but stepping with lateral movement is really what made a massive difference. And the faster the opponent's rushing at you, the harder it is for them to redirect their angles. Whereas you're going from a static position, going lateral is actually really, really easy. So these offline traverse steps or lateral movements proved really, really successful. The one thing you do have to bear in mind is that, are you fighting a left-hander or a right-hander? Because the angles that they typically thrust at, whether say a knife, change a little bit because people naturally have a hook in action. If they're fighting underhand, a right-hander hooks off to the left slightly, left-hander hooks off to the right slightly. And trying to work that out whilst you're trying to draw and process it all in your head is actually really quite difficult. Still, lateral movement, whichever way you did it against either hand, was still very, very beneficial. Now with lateral movement we were able to reduce the distances down, certainly to about 12 feet and actually be quite safe. And we were even able to manage 9 feet and even 6 occasionally. When I say that, I really do mean occasionally. It's not a safe distance, but it's just interesting to consider the scenarios of what would happen at these different distances, because we want to establish both what is a safe distance that you need to draw and what are your options if you have to draw at lesser distances. So, what we were then able to do was consider not drawing the sword at all initially and just getting the hell out of the way. So again, your opponent closes the distance, they expect to find you where you are. Leap out the way, then worry about drawing the sword. And the energy of their forward motion has gone, and you can gain quite a lot of distance in that time to draw the sword safely. Another interesting point we found was that with a rapier, with most swords actually, you draw into a hanging guard position. You're commonly going to cut around with cut one, nice diagonal powerful cut. You see that with the sabre all the time, you're going to see it with the rapier. Straight to the head, nice strong cut. What we did find though is that I started rushing on the draw and immediately cutting, assuming that the opponent would keep running at me to cover the distance as fast as they could. And the really interesting thing happened is when Damien attacked me this one time, and he came in, and as I got to the hanging guard ready to cut around, he recognised that I was cutting, and he stopped momentarily, just for the shortest amount of time, and allowed my cut to come past, and stepped in. So that's another interesting point, is don't assume that the knife attacker or any attacker is going to come at you. Just because they're running at the start, they're not necessarily going to be running all the way at full speed all the way. So don't cut immediately. You need to, again, still keep an eye on that distance work, because if you misjudge it, as I did in this particular occasion, I cut straight around, he dodged my cut and came in and got me. Now, against very, very close range attacks, and we're talking about the kind of stuff where you can't safely draw the rapier, which we've established is something like 15 feet or under, approximately maybe even 18 feet and under. If you are not confident about drawing your rapier in that time, what do? Well, against a knife attacker, you have a whole range of open hand knife defense sort of techniques at your disposal, which you should really have learned if you're learning to use edged weapons anyway. Of course, it would be far more beneficial to have a sword against a knife than open hand against a knife. But if you were able to draw the sword, then you'd be better off using the open hand to defend yourself than getting just bound up and stabbed when you're trying to draw the sword. Another really great option is most men who would have carried a rapier would have carried some kind of knife or dagger. Now, it might be a big enough dagger that it's designed to be used on the offhand. It might just be some kind of knife, or utility knife. But the chances are they would have carried one. And they often carried them on the right hip, like you would carry, again, a handgun for a right-hander on the right hip. And the reason for that is that you don't just want to be drawing with the offhand, the left hand, because if it was just for the left hand, you may well want the dagger on the left side. You want to very quickly be able to draw with the right or cross-draw with the left once you've already got the rapier drawn. And you'll see it in this scenario here, where actually at 6 feet, which you would think is an incredibly dangerous distance, if you just ignored your rapier and went straight to open hand on the left to actually use defensive knife work and draw the dagger in the right, you've then got a much safer scenario than trying to draw the sword where you're going to get stabbed at that kind of distance almost every time. The chances of safely drawing the rapier at 6 feet are so slim, it's unbelievable. Whereas if you very quickly went to the knife and getting the open hand out to defend yourself, it was a much safer way of fighting. On to fighting another sword. On this particular occasion, we've used a side sword by Black Fencer, which is a nice generic representation of all range of sort of Renaissance swords. And we go from a drawn scenario, so I perceive the threat of somebody's going to run at me with a sword already drawn, and I have to respond to it. The thing we found with the saber is when you're facing another sword, some of the lateral movement doesn't work quite as well because they've got the cutting arcs that can actually reach you as you use that lateral movement, and you've got a new threat, which is the cut. When somebody was coming at you with a knife, I mean, they might try and slash at you, but most likely the thing they're going to do is try and stab you, and that's your real concern in this scenario. But when they're carrying a sword, they've actually got the cut now, which they can use to beat your blade out of the way, and they can also use it to actually just cut you. So we've got a new threat, and particularly if you are defending yourself with thrust work, you have to consider the possibility of them taking your lead arm, whether you strike them or not. And again, we're trying to look at a scenario that defends ourselves. We don't want to get hurt in the situation full stop. And the trick is to come out alive, ideally completely unscathed. What we found with the sword defense is the distances weren't radically different, which is what we found with the saber. It was just that the lateral movement became a little bit less useful. The big advantage of going against a sword user with a sword rather than a knife attacker is they're going to be more inclined most of the time to maintain distance with you, as opposed to the knife attacker, which is going to charge you down, as well as the fact that most knife attackers, if they're going to go against, say, a handgun or a sword, they are very conscious and very aware of the fact that they are at a disadvantage once you actually draw, as opposed to the sword attacker who isn't. So in many regards, it's a little bit safer to be drawn against a sword user, even though then it's going to be a more matched fight, than it is against a knife attacker, which is really quite dangerous because he's going to close the distance at which you're not safe to actually use your sword. Defending yourself with the thrust rather than the cut does present us with some extra issues, and that is if somebody is coming at you with a knife and you defend with a powerful cut, there's not a lot they can do to stop it. Now, they can put their sort of offhand up and try and take the blow, but if it's a powerful cut, it should really deal some nasty damage, and with the kind of weight of a lot of swords, it should drive down and still strike them on the head as well. So you should be dealing quite a powerful cut, which can be followed with another cut as well. It's very difficult for them to do much about that. If they've got a very substantial dagger, like some of the things you might use with a rapier, some really substantial daggers, like some alehouse daggers, for example, some of the big things like that, then yes, they might be able to parry some of the sword strikes. But as a general rule, if somebody's coming at you with a knife or a dagger, the cut will get through. However, if you use the thrust against them, then if you look at, say, rapier combat, they're using the open hands to parry thrust off all the time. With a thrust, the energy is coming towards you, and it can be bypassed just one way or the other, just with the open hand, with minimal to no risk of cutting of the skin on your hand. And if you've got a glove on, likely not much of a problem at all. So you can just pass the blade off, and that presents a real problem. And you can see here is that if they time it right, and it's a real risk for the sword user in this case, they can just pass off your rapier and be right on top of you. Whereas if you keep that tip away from them and deliver a powerful cut, there's not that much they can do about it. So there's another risk of using the thrust for defensive work. Also bear in mind that you can strike more than once, and this is particularly the case if you use multiple cutting actions. It's not just about that first strike. They might stop it, they might evade it, whatever. You can hit them again and again. If they put their arm up, you can hit that, you can knock it down, you can then hit them on the head. Multiple cutting actions will be your friend often in these kind of situations. That knife fighter is going to try and stab you probably multiple times, one after the other. So there's no reason why, as the sword defender, you can't hit them 5 times. Then you may well need to or want to. In the last video with the saber drawing, I did talk about the possibility of having multiple possible threats. And a few people did comment on this as a potential training sort of exercise, and that is where you have multiple people, all who potentially could be threats to you, and you don't know which of them is going to attack you. Of course, you could be attacked by multiple opponents, or several of them, but that's not the drill we're looking at. We're looking at a single attacker in this particular exercise. So if you look here, you've got 3 people in a semicircular setup, all 21 foot away from me with the rapier. Each one of them's got a dagger, and who is attacking is randomly selected. And if you look at 21 feet, by this time I'd had a good bit of practice with the draw of the sword, still I was able to draw quite safely and recognise the threat in that time of 21 feet, except that one occasion where Damien on my right flank, which is the last person I'm going to see as I turn around, he got ahead of me a little bit. I think he might have even started a little bit earlier, and blindsided me. Came in on my right side as I'm turning around, and I just didn't get to see him and actually recognise that threat and draw fast enough, and he was on top of me. And that's the real sort of problem when you've got no idea of what threat is coming. You look in the exercises normally, there's one person right in front of you, and you see them draw the weapon. However, if there's more sort of chaos thrown into the mix like this, where you've got multiple potential threats, and bearing in mind these swords and knives were carried, and daggers, they were carried at a time where most men would be carrying weapons of all sorts, so the threat could come from anywhere. Another possibility that people were asking about was using the scabbard for self-defense. Now, unlike some other cultures, the sword is usually quite firmly secure in the bandolier, belt or baldric, depending on the design, so you couldn't easily withdraw the scabbard. However, you can rotate it around and strike your opponent as they close the distance. And this is a possibility at close range that you could consider. You see Mike do it here with the rapier, and he rotates the scabbard around in position and smacks Adam in the chin as he comes in. Now, Adam was wearing a fencing mask, as you can see, and he didn't really feel the impact and was able to just keep going. And you have to ask yourself, would that impact across the chin do something substantial? I think it probably would do, enough to knock your opponent aside, give you time to draw the sword afterwards. However, the big consideration, of course, is how accurate are you with it? Because if you don't crack him somewhere solid like the jaw, and it just strikes in his flank or his arm or something like that, it's not really going to do anything at all. So yes, you could do it, but the chances of it working are quite slim. I wouldn't want to really risk it. You'd be far better off using the open hands. So, in conclusion, this was the first time we'd used the rapier for these kind of drills. I've drawn rapiers before, but not in this kind of simulated self-defense scenario. So it took a little bit of time to get used to it, but before long, we did 70 draws on this one session. and I would say within maybe the first 10 to 15, my speed was up incredibly. So that's how quickly you can actually get used to it. I found that initially drawing, actually by gripping with a finger wrapping over the quillen, slowed things down quite a bit. The quillen here has a tendency to snag on clothing and the actual bandoliers and things like that. And also this grip itself is quite restrictive with the wrist. And I found that the absolute quickest and best way to draw the rapier was to turn it away from me and grip it with the thumb on the flat like you would hold a longsword, or Maya does with his rapier, and draw it with the thumb on the flat like this. Again, there was less restriction on the angles, it was much quicker, it was more reliable, there was less chance of getting the tip snagged, and you can just use that grip and defend yourself no problem. It still works perfectly well, and you can adjust your grip or not as the fight goes on. What did we find in terms of distance? Well, it was much the same as the sabre, in that the safe distance was something like 18 to 21 feet. That was the safe distance at which I could confidently draw against any opponent once I was just reasonably used to actually the body mechanics of it. And at lesser distances than that, it depended on the opponents I was facing. How fast were they? How were they inclined to necessarily deal with the situation? How confident was I with my draw, and did I make any mistakes? Because again, getting the tip snagged up on the way out is a mistake that is commonly made when you've got such a long rapier to draw. But yes, with a little bit of training and getting a little bit confident in the actual draw itself, you can get the distances down easily to 18 to 21 feet, and against a lot of attackers you can get it down to a safe 15-foot distance. Below 15 feet you need to use a lot of lateral movement, really get out of the way quickly, consider drawing after you've moved, and any closer than that you really need to rely on your open hand and a dagger if you've got one. So that was our conclusion to self-defense with the rapier. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please subscribe if you haven't already.